Hello, I'm Graham and I hope everyone's having a great day. Welcome to my beginner's guide series for the Panasonic Lumix FZ300 stroke FZ330. Now in today's video we're going to be looking at the IA and IA Plus modes. Now if you're just joining the series, have a look at the download section and I'm going to put a link to that in the video description below, where you can download the guide for this series and you'll be able to follow along. Also, I would have a look at the introduction to the series, as there we set up the camera with some specific menu settings so that if you're following the course you'll get the exact setup that we've got without worrying if you can't achieve the setup that we've got in the system at the moment. So today we are going to talk about the Intelligent Auto mode, and it's a mode I recommend that you start off with if you're a new user to the camera. It gets you familiar with handling the controls, and more importantly it learns you how to recognise some of the failings that the IA mode has. Having said that, it does give you the opportunity to create fantastic pictures, and in good light and with average situations you'll get good keepers from the resulting image sets. It's only when you stray outside the norms that you'll start to struggle with the IA mode because of its ways that it works. But more about that when we come across those specific circumstances. So what I want to do now is explain exactly what the IA and the IA Plus modes are. Now the Intelligent Auto mode is a facility by which the camera will judge the exposure and the type of scene that you're trying to take based on trawling through an image database, trying to match what it's seeing coming through the lens. So it has the opportunity of being able to look for landscape, portrait, food, sunset, those sort of things, and set optimum conditions within the camera JPEG processor to give you good results straight out of the camera. If it can't find a match in the database, it just uses a straightforward metering to give you the exposure. If we look at the scene we're presented with now on the screen, you can see I've got a couple of dolls sat on my initials and a doll in the centre. Now if I half depress the shutter button, you'll notice that the camera has determined that we're in a macro mode. It's judged the distance between the camera and the nearest object and said this is close enough for a macro shot, so it's dialed in the I macroed. And when it does that, it sets certain conditions for the camera. So it will set the aperture, which is best for macro, and depending on the amount of light it's seeing, it will set an appropriate shutter speed and the ISO. Now I'm going to talk about the exposure triangle, and if you've downloaded the beginner's guide, right at the very back of that is the exposure triangle. And all exposures are created from those three components: the shutter speed, the aperture, and the ISO, and each one of those will affect the image in a different way. Now the ISO governs the sensitivity of the camera system to light. The more sensitive it is, the higher the number you will see on the screen. So this camera goes from, say, ISO 100 to ISO 3200. The higher the number, the higher the sensitivity, but the downside of that is you will get grain or noise on the image. The lower you can keep that ISO number, the better the imaging result will be. The aperture will govern the amount of sharpness in the picture from the foreground to the background, and we call that depth of field. And the shutter is responsible for capturing that light for a specific instance to give you that right exposure. And shutter speed will govern the amount of subject motion blur if the subject is moving. Here we've got a desktop situation where there is no movement, so the camera in its ISO mode won't be looking for subject motion, so it will set a fairly low shutter speed. Now if I half depress the shutter button, you can see that the camera is going to give me an exposure of 1/80th of a second at f2.8. You can't actually see the ISO value until we take the picture. So what I'm going to do now is take that picture, and I'll use my remote release to trigger the camera so that we don't get an image shake on the camera. And I've got the reviews set to hold, so the screen will stay on the camera as long as I want it to. So for that particular shot, you see the camera used an exposure of f2.8, so it's used the widest aperture the camera has. It used a shutter speed of 1/80th of a second, and the ISO it used to make the exposure correct was 320. You notice on the screen that I've got image stabilization turned off, and that is a recommendation if you've got the camera mounted on a tripod. The image stabilization, if it's turned on, can actually give you image shake even though the camera is not moving. So if you have the camera mounted on a tripod, or it's on a monopod or on something solid, turn off image stabilization. You notice I've also got the camera shutter set to E shutter. The electronic shutter prevents any vibrations that might occur when the mechanical shutter fires. So if you can switch to electronic shutter, if you've got it mounted on a tripod, then you actually help yourself by alleviating any vibration from the shutter mechanism in this camera. It's telling me I am in the iMacro mode. It's telling me we've got a standard photo style, because we can only choose between standard and monochrome, remember, in the IA mode. And the metering mode is the whole area. You can see from over on the left hand side, it's used the whole area metering. If I come back to the shooting screen, what you may notice is when I press the focus button, is the camera is focusing on the nearest subject. And that is usual with this type of situation. In the automatic mode, it tends to favor the subjects which are nearer to the camera. So anything near to the camera will receive the best focus. So if I wanted the doll in the background to be sharp as well, unfortunately with this situation, with an aperture of f2.8, that doll in the background may not be as sharp as the one in the foreground. Now, to overcome this problem with the camera always trying to focus on the nearest object, you can specifically tell it where you want to focus if you go into the background defocus mode. And you can go into background defocus directly by pressing the function 2 button. When you press function 2, you notice we get a screen appearing which is the shutter speed and the aperture value. You notice at the moment the aperture value is f2.8. If I go to f4, which gives me slightly more focus from foreground to background, and I can do that by turning the top control dial, or I can use the left and right navigation key. And now when I press menu set, it will lock that value into the camera memory, and you can see that we've got F4 now on the screen, and there's a little symbol there that shows me that we're in background defocus. Now it will hold that value in its memory even if you turn the camera off. If you select background defocus again, it will come back to the value you've set. So that's a useful feature if you want to always have the camera set to a specific aperture. And f4 is the sharpest aperture this camera has, so it might be worth keeping f4 as the default in your background defocus mode. You'll notice now that it's also brought up a focus area. It's a fixed focus area, you can't change its position, but it does give the opportunity now of moving that focus point anywhere on the screen. And to do that, you use the left-hand navigation button, the one marked with the four-way cross on it, so it's the left-hand button. If you press that, you notice now you can change its position. So if I wanted the camera to focus on this doll in the middle, I can set the focus area on that particular one. Notice I can't change its size, there's no facility to give me a size position. I can take it back to the center by pressing the display button. So if I press display, it will put the cursor back into the middle. But again, by using this left-hand navigation key, I can move the position of that target. Now when I take that photograph, it will have focused on the area in the middle. So we now can change the focus point. So now if I wanted the background doll to be in focus, I can change this focus position either by using the cursor button to move its position, or I can move it by touching on the screen. So I can drag that over to the area that I want to be in focus. When I take the picture, the background doll will be in focus. If I wanted to cancel this background defocus that's being held at F4, if I press the function button, F2, and then press it again, you notice now it's cancelled out, and if I half depress the shutter button, you notice the camera goes back to its f2.8 state. The IA mode also supports subject motion tracking. So for example, if you've got something that's moving in your subject and you want it to stay in focus, like if you had a dog running around the scene and you wanted to track the dog, then you can use this method to make sure that the camera always focuses on that dog. Now the way you can set it up is multiple ways. You can use the four-way navigation dial, you can use a touch screen, or you can use the focus button on the side of the camera. If you use the focus button on the side of the camera, you'll notice it brings up a target area. Now what you do is position that target area on the subject that you want to be tracked. So I'm just going to reposition that so it's on the doll. Now I'm going to half depress the shutter button, and you'll notice that that target area goes to a smaller one and it will be highlighted in yellow. So I'm going to half depress the shutter button. You notice now we've got an image over the doll which is going to be tracked if the doll moves. So if I move the doll, you notice the camera is now tracking it, and wherever it moves on the screen the camera will lock focus, and I could take that picture and that doll would be sharply in focus, and it will continue to track it until you cancel it by tapping the AF lock or pressing the side button again. So now we've come back to setting our target. By default the camera is set up for the 49 area focus, so it will try to find focus on any one of those 49 points, with the closest point being the highest priority. But it's also set up for face detection as well. So if I was to bring in a subject which has got a face, so if I bring this photograph, you notice that immediately the camera has recognised there are two faces. I've actually gone through the process of face recognition and I've actually assigned a name. So my name is there, it's recognised me in the picture and it's set me as the principal focus. You notice my granddaughter here is highlighted as it's being recognised as a face, but there's no name to it, so I haven't actually recognised her within the camera setup, but my name would appear there because that has been recognised in the face recognition software. It also focuses on the eye, so if the eye is clear enough in the image, you'll notice that there's a white graticule which is on the eye which is closest to the photograph. So it's got face detection and eye detection to make sure you get the sharpest focus. So if I press the shutter button, it will have focused directly on that picture. If you've gone through the process of face recognition, if that face appears in a group of people, say at a wedding reception, and that person is on the back row, the camera will identify that face and it will set the focus on that face. So you can use that to prioritize focus in a group of people. As I said in the introduction, the IA mode uses an internal database of images which are used to compare to what's being received through the lens. So for example, when I turn from the program auto mode to IA, you'll notice that the camera immediately identifies the scene as a close-up, and you'll see a blue icon which stays blue for about 2 seconds and then turns to red to tell you that it's in the close-up mode. So if I switch to IA, you'll notice that the camera has recognized a close-up, it was blue and then it turned red. So that is the conditions that it will set up for this particular image. I've now changed the subject that we're filming, so I'm in the program auto mode again, and you notice the camera's already picked up the fact that we've got a face in the system. It's picked up the face and it's highlighted the eye, so we've got the crosshairs on the eye. Now if I go back to the IA mode, and it would do this if we were directly in the IA mode, but I'm doing this to just show you what happens, you'll notice we get the blue icon again, which tells me we're in a portrait mode, and then that will change to the red. So the camera's identified that as a portrait. So having set up for the portrait condition, it has a slightly enriched red tone and it smooths out the skin a little bit, so there's a little bit of softening goes on, but that's the way that the camera recognizes a portrait mode. And again, if I take that picture, we'll be able to see that the camera is focused on the eye, and you can see the conditions. Again, it's got the same exposure, 1/80th of a second, f2.8, and the ISO in this case is ISO 200. You can use the display key to give you more information about that image. So if I press the display key, we get a smaller image so we can see what the image is, but it tells me now I've got the aperture, I've got the shutter speed, whether there's been any brightness correction. At the moment there's not. The white balance is automatic white balance, and that is always the case when you're using Intelligent Auto. It always uses automatic white balance. Tells me the ISO, tells me the focus mode, which is autofocus single area. The image stabilizer was off, and things like intelligent resolution and intelligent contrast have been turned off. Tells me the mode that we took the picture with, so it was the portrait mode in the standard photo style. And you've got some information down here about the aspect ratio and the picture size. So it's 16:9, large picture size, fine JPEG quality, and the type of file was sRGB, which is the standard for printing and internet. Tells me the image number, which would be 11800165. Tells me the time that the image was taken and the date. Press the display button one more time and it gives me that information in a condensed form for the exposure, but it also gives me a histogram broken down into the red, the green and the blue components and the illuminance. Y stands for illuminance. It also tells me we're at 177 images on the card. We'll come back to the histogram when we talk about the manual features of the camera. Press the display button again, and again you've got a full screen view of the image. Press display again, it goes back to the standard screen. So if we looked at background defocus and the way that we can change the aperture to vary the amount of depth of field or the amount of focus between the foreground and the background. On the screen now you can see some real world examples where I took a portrait of this statue in a local park. The first picture is with the background defocus set down to f2.8, and I've got a slightly telephoto setting, so I've zoomed out to about 400 effective millimeters focal length, and you can see that the background is nicely blurred. So we've got a nice subject there, it stands out against a blurred background. If I let the camera have its own way in that bright sunshine, it would have chosen f8, and you can see the difference between f2.8 and f8 because the background is a lot more sharp and the subject doesn't stand out. So you can use this background defocus control to give you the opportunity of setting up a large aperture. Here you can see some flowers again that I took using the same method. Set the camera down to f2.8, set the telephoto position to full telephoto times 24, and you can see the background is really out of focus and it makes that subject in the foreground really stand out. If I switch to f8 again, you can see that the background is still in a defocus mode because we're using that 600mm lens, but again it's more sharp than if we use the f2.8. So you can use that to your advantage if you want to make plants or similar subjects stand out against the background. So we've seen background defocus control. Now the other one is the color tint, and the color tint control allows you to change the bias of the picture when we want it warmer or colder. And on the touch screen you'll notice we've got the IA symbol, and if we touch the IA symbol you'll get a panel come out which has got the color tint, the background defocus and the brightness correction. Now if I press color tint, you bring up a scale which goes from warm to cold. A is warm and B is cold. And if I slide that to the left or to the right using the touchscreen, or I can use the navigation dial, or I can use the top control dial, your preference. So if I wanted to make this picture a little more yellow, more warmer, I can move the operating point from the center over to the left hand side, and that makes the picture a little bit more yellow. If I wanted to make the scene colder, so if I wanted to create a scene which would look colder, I can move the operating point over to the right hand side. So if I take the picture in the middle and then I fully bias it over to the left hand side and take the picture and then bias it over to the right hand side and take the picture, you can see the change in those three images. And in a real world sense, again in the park, I took these two pictures, one with the camera set to the fully warming position and the other image is the one that's now set to the cold. The other control to consider is the brightness control. So if I touch the IA symbol on the touchpad, you notice now we have this symbol here, which is the plus and minus, and that allows us to change the brightness of the image. In real terms, we're doing what's called exposure value compensation. but we're actually changing the brightness of the subject. The camera always tries to make the subject a neutral grey. So all the colours that are in the photograph, it tries to make them into a harmonised 18% reflectance neutral grey. And that's the card that I've got set up behind this little doll now. If I take this picture, we're able to see the exposure. And it's again 1/80th of a second, f2.8, ISO 200. Now look what happens when I change that grey card for a white card, simulating what would happen if you were to take a portrait outside in snow. You now see that the doll's face has gone slightly darker. If I take that picture, you'll see the exposure's changed. It's gone from 1/80th to 100th, and the ISO has got from 200 down to 100. So we're now really underexposing this picture by one stop, because we've gone from ISO 200 to 100, and we've gone from 1/80th to 100. So we're about 1 1/3 stops underexposed because the camera is looking at a white card, and that's influencing the metering. So you would get this if you were trying to take a portrait in snow, or again on a beach scene where your skin tones match the sand. You could have the same situation. So to correct for that, if we come into the brightness control, we've got the facility to go between -3, which makes the subject darker, or +3, which makes it lighter. I've already established that we need to be about 1 1/3 stops. So you can use the navigation dial or the top control dial or the touchscreen to change that value. So I'm going to go by 1 1/3, which is what I thought we would need based on the exposure that the camera was giving me. So if I take that picture, you can see we've got exactly the same exposure that we had before. f2.8, 1/80th of a second, ISO 200. And you can see on the screen that we've got this exposure value compensation now of 1 1/3 stops. So you can change the way the camera reacts depending on its background. Now if I change that white card for a black card, we will get the reverse. So I've now put a black card behind, and you notice the camera has made this subject really light. Let's take off the exposure value compensation first. Let's put that back to the center point. You notice that the background isn't black. It's trying to make this again into a neutral grey component. If we look at the exposure, you can see that it's changed the exposure to ISO 400. So it thinks the situation is darker, and it's increased the exposure again by 1 complete f-stop. It's gone from ISO 200 to ISO 400. So for us to correct this scene, I would need to go into our exposure value compensation again. So again, I want to reduce the sensitivity because it's increased the sensitivity to 400. I want to make that subject back to normal by 1 f-stop. I can use the navigation dial, top control dial, or I can use the touchscreen. So I'm going to use the slider, and I'm going to go down 1 f-stop. So now if we take that picture, we're not quite there yet. We're looking at ISO 250, so we want to be about another 1/3 of a stop. So again, it's like the white card that was plus 1 1/3, the black card is minus 1 1/3. So again, if I take that picture, we've now come back to the exact situation, f2.8, 1/80th of a second, and ISO 200. So if we looked at the baby in all of those 3 pictures, the face would be the same shade as the white card, the grey card, and the black card. It's because the background is influencing the way the camera metering circuit is telling the camera what exposure to use. Now there is this facility in the record setup screen called Handheld Night Shot, and the Handheld Night Shot takes a series of exposures and then combines them into one image. So rather than it shooting say at 1/5 of a second to get you an exposure, it will take 1/30th of a second and make multiple exposures and then combine them to give you less noise and more brightness. That works to an extent providing there's no subject motion. So here are some images that I shot at Blackpool yesterday with the illuminations. The camera was in the handheld night shot mode. You can see multiple images are captured, and because of subject motion they appear as streaks on the image. So ideally you can only use this for a static subject. Anything that's got motion in it will appear as blur on the subject. It will only work in the handheld condition. If it's on a tripod, it won't enter the handheld night shot mode. It knows that it's static and won't enter that mode. So you've got to be handheld to enable this mode. So far in the IA mode, we've not talked about any video at all. I'm saving the video for a special video only section, and we'll talk about how to set up for video, how to use it in the IA mode and all the other modes. You can see the difference, but it's such a complex topic, I'd like to keep that for one special video sequence. Well, that's the end of the IA tutorial. Have a look at it in the guidebook and see if you can make sense of the settings that we've made today. In particular, the color tint, that's something you might want to use. Certainly background defocus is one that you would use quite a bit, and the brightness correction again is something you use quite a bit. So get to know how to enter those modes and get out of them, how to set them up and use them to the better advantage. It does give you the opportunity to create some fantastic images in the IA mode and extend its usefulness by using that IA Plus mode, which is now the default on the FZ300 330. So until the next one, where we're looking at the program auto mode, thanks very much for watching. If you're a new viewer, please do subscribe and hit the like button, and then have a look at my photographic blog. Again, there's a link to that in the video description below, where you can have a look at all the other topics that's been written on the FZ300 330. Have a look at the download section. There's some information on the 330 there. There's also the downloads guide that we were talking about here in this video. And on the home page is the application form for the 3 weekly newsletter. It's more than a newsletter, it's more of a technical article. If you've not subscribed to that, fill in the subscription form and you'll receive that every 3 weeks. So thanks again for watching. Please do take care, and I hope to see you all in the next one. Goodbye for now.